Conflicts of interest in the White House? Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is reported to have used his influence with the president to boost the family business. And Kushner has had his top-secret security clearance downgraded. Is that a sign of more chaos in the president's inner circle? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohamed Jamjoom. Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has a reputation for being one of the president's closest and well-listened-to advisors. But his role in the White House is being scrutinized because of U.S. media reports about the impact his business ties are having on U.S. policy. Questions are being asked whether or not he's misused his influence to secure money for his family business from foreign countries. Another concern is whether he helped Russian interference in Trump's election campaign. All the while, the president's appointed Middle East peace broker has had his top-level security clearance downgraded last week. Jared Kushner became increasingly powerful when he organized Trump's digital media strategy during his presidential election bid in 2016. The 37-year-old is married to the president's daughter, Ivanka. He took over his family's firm after his father was jailed for tax evasion. Kushner was appointed senior White House advisor when President Trump was inaugurated in January last year. Despite his lack of government experience, he was tasked with resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and was the president's lead advisor on relations with China, Mexico, and Canada. He's being scrutinized for his alleged links to Russia's interference in Trump's presidential campaign. Kushner admits meeting the Russian ambassador, but denies collusion. Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us here with me in Doha, Clyde Wilcox, a professor of government at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Bruce Fein, he's a former U.S. Associate Deputy Attorney General. And in Beirut, Rami Khouri, Senior Fellow at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy at the American University of Beirut. Welcome to all of you. Clyde, I want to start with you. President Trump famously said that there was no conflict of interest when it comes to the President of the U.S., but it's a different story for Jared Kushner. I mean, there is conflict of interest that applies to him, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's a lot that's unprecedented here. So we have the son-in-law and the daughter of the president in the White House. The son-in-law having an enormous portfolio, but as he travels, he's promoting his business. He's seeking business loans from countries that he is dealing with. And so even in the best of cases, even imagine it's squeaky clean, there's a smell to that, right? There's a problem with that arrangement.
Bruce, how worried would you be right now if you were Jared Kushner, and why?
It's not only that he's seeking loans from foreign governments that he has a portfolio over as a member of the administration, but it's known that he is in some kind of financial straits. He's searching desperately for loans to prop up some of his tottering real estate investments, and that's a clear sign that intelligence community looks for when they seek someone who they believe may defect or turn to be some kind of a counterintelligence problem. And that fits, I think, Kushner's financial situation like a glove. You also, I think, had omitted the fact that Mr. Kushner was in that June 2016 meeting with the Russians where they were going to promise dirt on Hillary, and he was there with Paul Manafort and Donald Jr. That's another connection we have to him in collusion. And then we also have this issue of him omitting literally scores, if not hundreds, of foreign contacts he had when he supplied his SF-86 in order to obtain a security clearance. If those things were intentionally withheld, they could be perjury problems with regard to Mr. Kushner. And lastly, it's quite clear from the leaks out of the State Department and the White House, probably Mr. Kelly, that Mr. Kushner has virtually no allies, many enemies, and the only person who's saving him is Mr. Trump himself, the president. And Mr. Trump is known to be quite erratic with regard to his loyalties. He's narcissistic, I think, to say the least. And I would feel very precarious of our Mr. Kushner at present.
Rami, critics of both President Trump and Jared Kushner say that Kushner's position in the White House makes a mockery of federal guidelines to prevent nepotism and conflicts of interest. But if there are guidelines that are in place, I mean, are they just being ignored?
Well, it seems that virtually the entire legacy of modern American governance and constitutional norms is being ignored, or at least twisted or reinterpreted in the way that one man wants to do that, Donald Trump. He sees the presidency as an extension of his own career rather than as a public responsibility and trust. The really big problem, along with all the other ones that have been mentioned by my fellow guests about the impropriety and the ethical issues, is that Kushner doesn't seem to have any competence in any of the things that he's actually entrusted with, as far as we can tell. The area where we have them, he doesn't do press conferences, he doesn't allow himself to be questioned. There's no real public accountability or transparency. The only area where we have quite a bit of knowledge about what he is actually doing is the Palestinian-Israeli peace talks that he's supposed to be coordinating or heading, and he's proved totally incompetent there. Not only incompetent, but the policies that he's pursued have pushed the United States into the greatest isolation globally that has ever been on this issue, 14-1 against the U.S. and the Security Council. The talks have broken down. The Palestinians won't even meet the vice president when he goes to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So the level of impropriety, or apparent impropriety, let's say, is matched by a level of incompetence that is quite shocking for any branch of government, let alone the White House.
Clyde, I want to build on what Rami was just saying there. He was talking about Jared Kushner's role as an envoy for peace in the Middle East. Now, Jared Kushner has recently had his security clearance downgraded. In order to be a peace envoy, especially in such a volatile region as this, wouldn't one need to have access to top secret information to help facilitate that job?
Yes. I think it's remarkable that he had a top secret clearance as long as he did, given the problems that the other guests have mentioned about his debt and the seeking out the money and so forth, and the many, many versions of the forms he's been filing. He's been incompetent to date, and now he will have even less information than in the past.
The fact that it's pointed out that Mr. Kushner has virtually no competence in any of the areas of the portfolio that he's handling makes you suspect that the reason why he even accepted the position that he enjoys in the White House was as a surrogate to advance his business interest. There's nothing that suggests Mr. Kushner has not only any competence, but any interest in pursuing these areas. So he asks us, well, then why did he accept a position in the White House other than to advance his business interest that creates the conflict that you've pointed out earlier?
Okay, Bruce, let me follow up that by asking you, he's had his security clearance downgraded. He no longer has access to the president's daily intelligence briefing. Do we know what he has access to at this point?
That's the top secret in what's called specialized compartmental information he does not have access to. But he would have access to what's called secret. Now, in classified information, that's lower rung sensitivity of information. Now, it's the executive branch who decides what to stamp as secret or classified or top secret. It's a largely subjective area, so we don't know exactly what information he does have still available to him. But I think the symbolic gesture of Mr. Kelly suggesting that he no longer has confidence that he should be entrusted with the president's daily brief indicates that Mr. Kelly will not include Mr. Kushner on discussions. These may not be documents that could involve sensitive classified information. He's been frozen out. So he's kind of a lone ranger now, and he doesn't have the ability to consult with others because he's viewed somewhat as a pariah at the highest level in the chief of staff.
Rami, isn't it the case that the architects of American democracy thought it was a bad idea to hire presidential relatives? I mean, are we now seeing evidence of why so many who came before in American government were so loath to have relatives of presidents working alongside presidents in the White House?
Right. You've had this occasionally in history. You had Robert Kennedy as Attorney General for John Kennedy, but that was done under certain circumstances that were seen to be acceptable. But the thing about Trump, the whole Trump family under President Donald Trump, is that they have basically turned on its head this extraordinarily impressive legacy of American constitutionalism and governance by the people, for the people, and of the people. And there are cases, of course, of corruption and abuse of power and unethical behavior in the United States, and those are often caught, not every one of them. But the central tenet of American governance is that it's a system based on the rule of law, not on the rule of personal people, men and women, who enrich themselves, as is the case in much of the rest of the third world and other parts of the world. So this is the real tragedy and danger of what is happening in the U.S., compounded just yesterday when Trump apparently said that he likes what President Xi is doing in China, having perpetual rule for life, and maybe he'll try it himself one day. So this is where the real story is. How far and how effectively can the institutions of American life, the press, the courts, the political parties, citizens peacefully demonstrating, education system, how can they push back using those instruments of constitutional governance to protect the constitutionalism as it has been practiced for 2¼ centuries? And this is the real test, I think, in the final analysis. That's why Kushner is such a glaring insult, not just to Arabs and Israelis when he's presented as the peace negotiator. He's an insult to the American people and their own legacy of having the rule of law. And we'll see how this plays out.
Clyde, I saw you react to what Rami was saying. What are your thoughts? What's your reaction to what Rami was saying?
Yeah, so I fully agree, and I'd like to sort of think about, we know why Kushner might accept, but why would Donald Trump have put a novice with no experience in this position? And the one thing we know about Donald Trump, he's narcissistic. He also trusts no one. He really has no close personal friends. They're all business relationships. And so the people he trusts, are his family. And but totally irresponsible to give this much, of a portfolio to someone with so little experience.
Bruce, the Washington Post reported that U.S. intelligence services had determined that officials in 4 countries, including the UAE, China, and Israel, that they had been privately discussing how to use Jared Kushner's real estate investments as a way to gain leverage over him in order to influence official U.S. policy. So this becomes about more than concerns of nepotism, right? I mean, this becomes more about concerns about national security at this point, correct?
That is right. Dual loyalties, that they see that his financial straits enable them perhaps to sway his views by offering him money or loans or otherwise. They see him very vulnerable. And the other area that I'd like to just amplify the earlier statements about turning constitutionalism on its head, there are 2 elements of Mr. Trump's behavior that are really quite disturbing, gone beyond any previous president. Number one, he openly says, I need an attorney general to protect me. He views his other government officials and cabinets, they are not to protect the Constitution of the American people, to protect him individually. The second thing is that he demands personal loyalty to himself. He says, your loyalty is to me, Mr. Trump, not to the Constitution of the United States. Now, we know where that originated. That was the oath that Hitler demanded of his civil servants in the military. And it's really quite extraordinary. I served in the government for 15 years, and my loyalty was the Constitution. I served during the Nixon administration when he was under assault, when he said if the president does it, it means it's legal. And never did I once think that my loyalty was to anything but the Constitution. That's what Elliot Richardson said when he resigned. That's what Bill Ruckelshaus said. That's why the system worked. The difference is at that time, there was a revolt against these ideas. Mr. Trump says them, and there's complacency with the Republicans in Congress and elsewhere that's truly extraordinary.
Rami, I want to talk about the reports that there was a possible deal between Qatar and Jared Kushner and Kushner's businesses that fell through just weeks, fell through, and then weeks later the White House possibly backed the blockade against Qatar. Whether this was coincidence or whether this was retaliation, how severely does that undermine the credibility of the U.S.?
Well, it certainly looks bad for the White House. We don't know the exact details, and there's only probably 3 or 4 people in the world who do know, who are involved in those talks, but it certainly looks very bad. What's clear is that when the Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, and Egyptians put the siege on Qatar in early June of last year, the American response was totally confused. You had the White House, the Defense Department, the State Department, all saying slightly different things. It took them about a month to more or less get on the same message. So it's not clear who is actually making policy on that issue, but it certainly looks bad for Kushner, for Trump, for the White House, and for the American political system that somebody would go and try to get a massive multi-hundred-million-dollar investment or loan to save a sinking real estate project, and then when that is turned down, that same person joins the chorus against Qatar. But this is part of the bigger problem, again, of the White House. There's over a dozen people who have resigned from the White House senior positions, and there's 5 or 6 people who are somehow linked to Trump or his campaign or his White House or his staff who have been indicted. Some of them have already pleaded guilty. So there's just a big complex of people who are behaving in ways that the American culture sees as inappropriate, unethical, illegal, or even dangerous. And that's why there's a special prosecutor. The full power of the law has now been brought in to investigate all these issues, whether it's Russia and the campaign, and now it's dealings of Kushner and other things are being investigated as well. So Kushner is the kind of tip of the iceberg here. He's the most dramatic and most glaring example of this apparently unethical behavior. He still hasn't been indicted. There are mostly reports in the press that we're dealing with, so we just have to give the guy his constitutional rights and wait till the actual facts come out in a court of law or in some other mechanism. But it seems that he's just the tip of a much bigger iceberg, a bigger problem of people who behave in this way, and they are very much the reflection of Donald Trump's way of life.
Clyde, the New York Times is reporting that an advisor to the UAE's Crown Prince has been questioned, and the special counsel Robert Mueller wants to know whether George Nader, who's a regular visitor to the White House, attempted to buy political influence. I mean, how is the region seeing the U.S. in the midst of all this reporting that's going on, especially in light of the GCC crisis?
Well, I'm sure there's, as I said before, the real problem is whether there's anything here or not, we have to be suspicious, right? From what I've heard, Kushner has pushed business deals in the middle of a conversation about policy as he's traveled through the region. And I think it's just a great problem for America that we have a man who has been mixing these things up, because you have to assume the worst if you're another country.
Bruce, Jared Kushner divested himself from only a small portion of Kushner companies before he started working at the White House, but he's retained substantial ownership still. What I'd like to know is how different is that, what he did, in comparison to what other officials who were entering government work or the White House did to divest themselves from their businesses?
Well, I think it was standard practice up until the Trump administration that someone coming into the administration would put their serious assets in a blind trust, and they would have no control over what was invested. They wouldn't know what deals were being done, and that was a way to ensure that they couldn't have a conflict of interest. It's really, it's unprecedented that the open and notorious retention of business interests that obviously could be influenced by American foreign policy create clearly and the appearance of divided loyalties here. And it's a sad day when the standard for remaining in public life in the White House is, well, you're not been indicted for a felony yet. I mean, surely we demand more of our public servants than, well, you skated above the felonious line. And that's kind of what we're giving Jared Kushner to. I mean, not only combined with the incompetence, but with the obvious suggestion of nepotism and conflict of interest, he should voluntarily depart just because of the appearance problem that we have. But that's something that the Trump people resisted, putting all their assets in a blind trust. And you have to ask them, why is that? Why would they not be comfortable putting assets in a blind trust? And the only answer that's readily apparent is because they wanted to use their political stature to promote their business interests.
Rami, turning back to the Mideast peace process again and building on something you said a short while ago, it's been reported in the last few days that Jared Kushner now wants to pivot wholeheartedly into presenting his plan for Israeli-Palestinian peace. But not only is that difficult because of his security clearances being downgraded, it's also difficult because of a lack of credibility that people are accusing him of having. Many of his critics say he's just not an objective player because he has extensive business ties to Israel. I mean, how is it he can now pivot into this? Would he be taken seriously in this process?
It can't be taken seriously at all, and that's one reason why it's gotten nowhere. And not only has it gotten nowhere, but the Trump administration, with Kushner's involvement, with Adelson, Sheldon Adelson, the big pro-Israeli financier and a political donor who supports right-wing groups in Israel and the United States, who's supported Trump, and other people, have taken the initiative on the Jerusalem decision that the United States government made to move its embassy to Jerusalem, which has completely wiped out 30, 40 years of diplomatic negotiations, which haven't succeeded fully, but clearly were creating a set of rules and an outline for what a final permanent Israeli-Palestinian, Arab-Israeli peace could look like, and has completely thrown that out the window and generated huge obstacles in the way of just even getting the Israelis and Palestinians to talk to one another, has wiped out the credibility of the United States as an impartial mediator, which was already very low anyway with the legacy of Dennis Ross and people like that in the government who for decades promoted policies that most people in the region and internationally saw as leaning to the Israelis rather than being even-handed. And further, the third problem is that you've got this, relating to the question you asked a couple of questions ago, what do Arabs think of what they see in the White House and Trump? The reality is that there are a lot of power elites in the Arab world, leaders of governments, kings and emirs and others, presidents who love Trump, and they just want to be part of what he's doing. They're desperate for his support, and therefore they are trying to get close to him. But the reality is that these are also leaders in the Arab world who are wildly out of touch with their own people and have very little credibility at home and have massive internal problems in their own countries. So what you're seeing is the fragmentation of the Arab world into a small power elite that is desperately trying to align with Trump or any foreign power that'll protect them, and masses of people inside the Arab world who are much less supportive of that and much more critical of what the United States is doing, partly because of the mass support in the Arab world for a just resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's just for the Israelis and just for the Arabs as well, and that's not what we're getting out of the White House. So these are all dimensions of the incompetence and the political tilt that the American government has practiced under Kushner's mandate.
Clyde, critics of Robert Mueller charge him with working outside the scope of his mandate, that if he's focusing on Kushner, he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. What do you say to that?
Well, so Kushner was involved in meetings, as we've just heard, with the Russians. So that's clearly within the mandate. The fact that he actually was seeking money from Russians too makes this whole money-seeking project connected to the Russian investigation. But special prosecutors have some leeway in expanding the scope as they find other examples of malfeasance. The final thing I'd say here is that Kushner, some people have said, is like the tip of the iceberg. What I've heard from many countries as I've traveled is we have been told to move our events to Trump Towers. We have been told to move our events to Trump hotels. So this has been the norm of the administration, to build business for the Trump family and the Kushner family through foreign policy.
Bruce, how much longer do you think Kushner has a role in this White House? Do you think he's going to be pushed out, or does he survive this in the short term at least?
No, I think he's done. I think he has no friends. The leaks will continue. He'll be shut out of meetings other than perhaps with Mr. Trump himself that are important. And I think the pressure will be great, and he and Ivanka will leave. I would say, with regard to the writ that you mentioned, under which Mr. Mueller is operating, it is narrower than the special prosecutor writs that were given to Archibald Cox and previous special counsels, but it's superintended and enforced by the Deputy Attorney General, who would entertain claims that he's going beyond the scope of his investigation. It is true that it cites collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign as the prime target, but it also says, as a kind of a residual clause, that anything that emerges out of that investigation is also fair game. But the fact is, Mr. Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, is the one who's empowered to police whether or not he's stepping outside of his jurisdiction. And moreover, remember that even if it is outside of his jurisdiction, it's not like the issue goes away. It would just be transferred to the main Justice Department attorneys who would continue to investigate if it had credibility. And we know that Mr. Trump feels uncomfortable about that. He's called his Attorney General most recently disgraceful because he gave to the Inspector General the task of determining whether there are problems with this FISA warrant concerning Christopher Steele and this dossier on Trump. And so whether it's within or outside the special counsel's writ, it's going to remain as a burr in the side of the administration.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Clyde Wilcox, Bruce Fein, and Rami Khouri. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohamed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.